Good evening and welcome to the Interfaith Centre for the third in this series of the Talking Heads project. I'm Anya McMahon and I'm joined here this evening by the Archbishop of Dublin, Michael Jackson, Head of the Church of Ireland. Good evening, Your Grace.
Good evening, how are you? Very nice to be here.
Very nice. And you grew up in Lurgan, County Armagh, the son of a rector. Is that what inspired you to get into the faith?
Well, as you rightly say, that's where I was born. I lived there for a short time, then I moved to County Fermanagh, but I did grow up in a rectory. I probably had quite an influence on me, although sometimes in my line of work, it works the other way around, because people can be completely turned off it by being overexposed to it when they're young. A number of people I know who would have grown up in rectories and been part of the life of the church, sometimes they feel that the moving around or the sort of invasion of privacy is what they don't want, and so they mightn't want it. But I never really saw it like that. I thought one of the fascinating things about it was that you met a broad range of people that you wouldn't have met in any other context, and there are always people in and out of the house. And you know, sometimes people would come and you say, would you look after so and so, or would you take them for a walk or make them a cup of tea or something like that. So you got a chance to meet people, and I suppose that's part of what encouraged me to do it. And
you grew up in the north, of course, so did you experience much segregation?
Yeah, well, I suppose segregation is just part of life in Northern Ireland. I mean, you might say, have things not changed? But I suppose when I was a small child, I mean, where does it hit you? I suppose it hits you first of all in schooling. It also hits you depending on where you live. I grew up in a village called Ballinamallard, which is in County Fermanagh, which at that stage would have been 100% Protestant. I mean, there are, I think, 2 or 3 villages that are like that. And there are vast parts of Northern Ireland which would be sort of at that stage 100% Roman Catholic. It doesn't of itself make you intolerant. It just means that you grow up in a particular sort of sociology. I you're aware of it in a sense, but through the rest of your life you meet people of other denominations, and then, you know, as you begin to travel you meet people of other world faiths. So, I mean, I can see what you mean. I think seen from a perspective in the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland probably looks a very segregated place. I mean, religion obviously is a segregating influence, education the same, and social life. The other thing I suppose that would have been very much part of my life as a young person and as a teenager would have been the Troubles. And that brings its own form of segregation, because not only as the events happen do people, as it were, view them along traditional fault lines, but also living and growing up in a rural area, as would be the case, but in a different way in an urban area. There's a curfew. I mean, you're kind of asking for trouble if you're out after dark. You can get trouble if you're out during the day, but you're asking for trouble if you're out after dark. So I suppose segregation takes many, many forms. Some people, depending on their experience, it would make them cautious, make them maybe embittered. I suppose I would remain cautious, but I don't think it has really made me bitter. But I suppose I'm very fortunate, because even though I lived on the border and there were lots of difficult situations, lots of people who suffered tremendous loss, tragedy, loss of life, impairment, we never specifically as a family suffered that. So we were very blessed.
And you went to Dublin to attend Trinity College.
I did.
Did you enjoy your time there?
I did. Part of the reason I did that was, I suppose I grew up in a country area, and I wanted to see what life was like in the city. Also, having grown up in Northern Ireland, I wanted to see what Dublin was like, and what living in the Republic was like. I found it much more straightforward in ways than I suppose you might think. Quite a lot of people in Northern Ireland would make their way to Belfast and go maybe to Queen's University or Coleraine, or go to the University of Ulster, or I think as the Troubles bit and dug in, would have gone across to the UK. And when I was in Trinity College, which was, I suppose it's generations ago, 75 to 79, must seem a very long time away, but when I was there wouldn't have been all that many people from Northern Ireland. Interestingly, I think now, I heard quite recently, that universities in our part of Ireland here have had something like a 24% increase in applications. Partly, I think, because the fees in the UK are going up from 3,000 to 9,000 a year or something. But Trinity College, I suppose, in those days, Still, I think an awful lot of people were from Dublin. And if you're there on your own and you're accustomed to living at home and you see people going in and out from home, it doesn't make you miserable, but you realise that they have kind of a domestic life that you don't have. But I know I enjoyed it very much indeed. And I suppose I met people, and it's part of my motivation, I suppose, I met people I wouldn't have met otherwise. And I always find that interesting.
And you spent time as a chaplain then. What
I
kind of
did.
problems do you think students face and students are facing now in terms of a crisis of faith? Because a lot of people go to university, they'll fall out with the faith to become maybe atheist or agnostic.
Yeah. I was chaplain for 7.5, nearly 8 years. I think, an awful lot of people don't give young people a chance because they see young people as people with problems, people with behavioural problems, people with difficulties and anxieties, people who sort of malfunction. I think that's very unfair. I think most students are driven by a desire to find a combination of personal fulfillment and also to be altruistic, to do things for other people. That would have been my experience. One of the first difficulties I would have found that people had, very often, a sad situation, maybe it's not quite the same in Ireland, but I'd say increasingly it is, people would have found that when they left home to go to university, their parents decided that they would finally separate, divorce. And so you would have people who are there maybe for 4-6 months, and suddenly they find basically they've no home to go back to during holidays. That in a sense, the domestic life, which may have been difficult for them when they were at home, collapsed. Now that taught me something really important, which is that no matter how difficult things are for people, to have something that's difficult is better than to have nothing. That would be one of the contexts. The other thing in relation to faith, which I think is a very good question, is it's maybe a time of exploration, or maybe it's a time of completely no interest. And I think there are an awful lot of caricatures of what faith is and what religion is that people have, and people find it very uncool to be seen, to explore it and to be religious. And I think one of the things that I would have noticed, depend what you're talking about, because where I was in Oxford, the people who had a very strong expression of their faith were actually the English Roman Catholics, because they were in a sense a minority.
Yeah.
And so they would have a very strong network both within the colleges and across the university. The other thing that would have been strong religiously would have been things like Christian unions. And I suppose part of the role that they fulfilled in a contemporary role would be what we might think of as informal church or house church. You would have had young people who were leaders. Part of the difficulty, I suppose, with the conventional church is those sort of layers of hierarchy, and people don't know how to weave their way through them. And so they see it as something that's delivered by somebody else to them and for them, but not really in consultation with them. So I suppose that would be part of the faith thing. Increasingly, while I would have been in Oxford, there would have been people of world faiths other than Christianity. And they obviously, for them, there would have been specific provision. But I was fortunate because, people groan at the idea of the Church of England being the established church. We don't have established churches in Ireland, and so we have a totally different cast of mind. But it does give a kind of umbrella through which people can explore questions of faith if you use it in a way which is open and generous. But I wasn't fortunate enough to have anything like what you have here, a very visible interfaith centre, and the footfall, as people would say, sort of outside the windows and everything, and people know that the vitality of faith, the exploration of faith is part of what is on the menu when you're in DCU. It wasn't built in that sort of way, but I think this is a very exciting focus. So that, I suppose, would be a roundabout answer to your question. First of all, people would have their own kind of difficulties maybe at home that would impose themselves on them. They had a lot of work to do as well. People don't always have to. My daughter's now a student, and
would you like to see her join the faith, perhaps?
She has. She would be a faithful person. I don't think she's probably going to become a cleric, although she could in our tradition. She's doing medicine. But what I was going to say is that, I mean, she might get an email or a phone call from a supervisor saying there's supervision at 9 Sunday morning, or there's one at 5 on Sunday evening. So the idea of kind of Sundays and freedom, as it were, to do that sort of thing, you just need to improvise. But there's a lot of work. Yeah.
And how do you balance family life with your role?
Well, it's a very interesting question. In a way that's complicated. I'm a kind of nightmare to live with because I've moved a number of times. And my wife is a doctor, and currently she has a job in Belfast. Before that, when we lived in County Tyrone, in my previous days, she had a job in Belfast, slightly easier, but a bit longer from here. And my daughter now, well, there's just 3 of us in the family. My daughter, she's a student in England. So I suppose what we do is we try to be honest with one another, I suppose. We each know that we have a love and a strong affection for one another. It's not always possible to express it because you're tied up and you're busy. She's a doctor and she's got a very busy cycle. The reason I'm late today is that I had to bring 2 other people to Cork to a funeral, got into a taxi, got here late. It's just balancing it, difficult during what you might call the season. The season starts in September and that doesn't finish till the end of June. Sure. And one of the difficulties in the church thing is that you have a second shift at the weekend. You have a second shift often on bank holidays and things like that. So just trying to be fair and honest and use the time that you have together.
And do you find people in the Anglican community are being spread quite thin at the moment, with regards to being spread around parishes due to the...
I would, yeah. If you're looking at statistics, they're always out of date. I think I have to be honest. But if you're looking at statistics and you take the 26 counties, theoretically I think there'd be about 55,000 Anglicans in the Diocese of Dublin and Glendalough, and about the same maybe in the rest of the Republic, or maybe even slightly less than that. So we are thinly spread. I suppose what's happened over the course of history, people would have been settled or established in particular areas, and that doesn't happen all the time, so there isn't a great infusion of new people. Part of what happens then is that people make life choices for themselves, and they might marry or form partnerships with people who are not Anglicans, and so in a sense they have to make a choice as to how they're going to express their faith. We have a small growth in numbers, I suppose, in that with the great diversity of people now living in Ireland from countries overseas, a number of those would be Anglicans. Not only, but maybe in a slightly concentrated way, people coming from parts of Africa who would be Anglican in their country of origin and would explore and express that here. But our numbers are sporadic. As you probably know, if you head to the rural areas, they're very thin. And inevitably...
are we facing a crisis then, perhaps?
A crisis? Well, I'd have to ask you a question. What's your definition of a crisis? My definition of a crisis, I suppose, is that there's always a point where you have to think and try and think radically. Now, most people groan at radical thought because they sort of say, what are you going to close? Maybe you're not actually going to close anything, but I'd say a couple of things. One is that very often, if you have a very small number of people in church, the worship feels very different from having a bigger group. And I like to think that people could experience both, because sometimes I think you need anything up to 200 people, at least, for an act of worship really to take off. And that's not so easy in small scattered communities.
Well, it's been a very interesting discussion for the first half, and I'm going to hand you over to my capable host, Aisling Scally.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed that. Anya, thank you.
Hello, Your Grace.
How are you?
Thanks very much for joining us.
Not at all, thank you.
Not at all. I'm going to switch the focus now to education.
Yeah.
Recent staff cuts have had a big impact on primary schools. Do you think this will affect Church of Ireland primary schools?
Yeah, I will. I think, I like the way in which you express it because it's a new situation, and I think if I can take a word that your colleague used, a crisis, that has come to all schools. The question of changes in terms of the pupil-teacher ratio is one thing. The question of rural transport, particularly another. Special needs assistance is another thing. There are three things at least. Now that affects everybody. You might say, why can't I leave it at that? What I can say is because of the thinly spread and sporadic nature of the Church of Ireland population across the country, it affects disproportionately.
And of course there's schools in smaller rural areas that would be quite small. So would they be phased out, or would you have a fear about that?
One of the things that the Minister of Education has said is that he's not going to phase out schools. So it's a question of our coming up with some strategies which actually meet the Minister and the Department halfway. And I've been trying to get this across to people. You cannot simply hope that the status quo will continue simply because you hope it will last. What you have to do is you have to make some sort of accommodation with the people who are now making decisions in virtually impossible contexts. Another thing that's happening is the idea of what will constitute a viable school. Two-teacher schools may become one-teacher school, five-teacher schools may become a four-teacher school. A one-teacher school is tremendous anxiety. First of all, I think because of the educational opportunities for the children. If you're teaching everything across a range of maybe 7-8 classes with one teacher, it's quite a juggling act. The other thing is that in terms of safety and security, it's very tricky as well. So that is one of the fears. The other thing is that if you listen, people say 70 million euro cuts, oh dear, but it's 70 million this year, next year, the year after, and the year after. So in a sense, it's only started.
Yes. And the Church of Ireland is kind of traditionally viewed as a wealthy landowning class. Is that still the case in 2012?
I would largely say rubbish. Because the Church of Ireland, historically, I suppose, the picture is of large landowners living behind stone walls with hundreds of acres. Not many people like that around. Most Church of Ireland people are actually like other people. Some will be teachers, some will be lecturers, some will run businesses, some will farm, some actually are part of the terrible density of rural and urban poverty, both of them that we have. There are parts of this diocese where there is significant rural poverty as well as urban poverty. So I think there's a little bit of a mythology there about Church of Ireland people having a lot of money and kind of keeping it discreetly quiet. I don't think it's like that. And I've worked in a number of places. I've worked, as I say, for Man and Monaghan, that area, here for the second time, and I've worked in Cork. And it is a mixture.
And many Church of Ireland schools would traditionally charge fees.
Yes.
So how would the kind of disadvantaged population cope with that?
Well, the whole question of fee charging schools has come very, very much to the surface. And as I'm sure you're all aware, just when we were kind of tidying up the wrapping paper as 2011 turned into 2012, the Minister for Education announced an audit on fee charging schools. The word audit, I think, gave people indigestion. What I think the Minister wanted to see was what combined use a school made of the per capita grant, which is given, as it were, for the education of each child in the state, together with the extra money which came in through the levying of fees. Now, you say, how do Church of Ireland parents, in a sense, find the money to enable their children to be educated in Church of Ireland style or Church of Ireland based schools?
Ethos.
I think that's kind of the question you're asking about ethos. I'd say with difficulty. There are some historic grant awarding bodies which try to be as helpful and as generous as they can. Government actually is helpful to us in that there is a certain amount of provision made for that. But then, depending on the school to which you go, it depends on what level of fee it charges in relation to what in another industry you would say the services it offers and provides. So the fees can alternate very quickly. There is one school in our system, Wilson's Hospital at Multifarnham, which has gone into the free scheme. And what that means is that actually the government pays for all the teaching, and then there are other aspects of the life of the school, which is boarding, where there is assistance and where parents find the way. One of the big advantages, I think, for Wilson's Hospital, which I visit regularly and with which I'm involved, is that it's not enormous. The difficulty, I think, now, and the people involved in it would kind of agree with me in this, is that schools which at a time when expansion was a norm really expanded now have a difficulty because we're living nationwide in an era of contraction. So there's a number of kind of approaches to your question. I think the important thing, and I did encourage the schools to do this, is actually to cooperate with the department. Because any time I have the opportunity to talk with the department together with other people, what the minister is saying to me, publicly and privately, it's the same thing. We need your schools to talk with us. Because if they don't, we don't know what they're doing and we don't know what their needs are.
So would you see many schools, they will see Wilson's Hospital School as a model and try to enter the state system in the same way? Do you see that emerging as a pattern in the future?
Well, I really do think that it's a pattern that other fee-charging schools should examine quite seriously, because it has a number of advantages, one of which is that the teaching is secured. And what seems to have happened is that the pupil-teacher ratio has been recalibrated in that it's gone back to what it used to be. So there's that. The other thing I would say is that through giving that level of security, it's then able to maximise what else it can do in relation to boarding and other facilities. Now, of course, the free scheme will not work in the same way for each school, but the Wilson's model has a lot to commend it, and it's worked out in complete cooperation with the department. So that might be the end result for a number of other schools, and from what I've seen of it in Wilson's, it worked well.
Great. And zooming back to primary school education again,
Yes.
Are you happy with the teaching of religious education with the Follow Me programme at primary school level? Do you think it provides a good education?
I do. Follow Me, from what I understand, is actually quite an ecumenically based programme, because the Church of Ireland was generously offered the material which was used within the Roman Catholic Church, and we adapted it to our requirements. I mean, our requirements are not all that radically different, but I think part of the way in which the Constitution meets parenthood is through education. That parents are given a constitutional entitlement in Ireland to have their children educated in the context of an ethos which is one which they want and with which they're happy. So in what may seem a rather quaint way, but I think is quite important, is that the school is seen as an extension of home life. But the Follow Me programme, I think, is sufficiently clear about what is Church of Ireland identity, while at the same time always setting such an identity within the much wider context of identity, which is that of being a Christian person. Because denominations can't survive on their own. They need to come to the well of the wider picture to drink.
And having said that, how do you feel about Educate Together primary schools?
Well, from what I know of Educate Together seeks to provide education in a way which is not overtly denominational, but at the same time gives opportunity for those who have a denominational emphasis and interest to have that education provided within the context of the school. So it's a kind of layered thing. There is a sort of, I wouldn't say religion free, I don't mean it that way, because that sounds as if it's religion squeezed out. But I mean, there is, in a sense, a secular and a pluralist context. And within that, as it were, parents, I think in particular, can make arrangements for religious education. It could ironically be through clergy in the local area. But I suppose the difference between that and the Church of Ireland National School is that somehow we still grapple with this idea that a spirit of what it is to live life in a Church of Ireland way is pervasive across the school, whereas in a way the Educate Together is much keener, I think, to have a pluralist ethos. Now, there's a lot of pluralism in the Church of Ireland, but at the same time there's slightly different things. So I suppose, but that I think you see is one of the pressures, because if there is dis-ease or anxiety about the viability of Church of Ireland schools, particularly if they're small, parents could easily say, well, there is another school with 200 pupils, not all that far away. My child will have a wider and a deeper educational experience, and that's the decision I'm going to make for the well-being of my child. So that's another one of those invisible pressures. It's not actually put upon us by the Educate Together schools. It's put upon us by the anxiety that there is in the current fluidity. But I mean, as I said to you before, I've been encouraging people at second level and at primary level to cooperate with government, because no matter what we make of the mess that got us into the mess, those who are now trying to deal with it are trying to deal with something which is extremely difficult.
And also it cuts in, back to second level again, cuts in second level spending, subjects are in danger of being dropped. How would you feel if religious education was taken away from second level students?
Now, can I just ask you to clarify, by religious education, you mean religious education as a non-exam subject?
As a non-exam subject, yes.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what I would say is, as long as people are in school, the school in a sense is in loco parentis. It has a parental role. And I think that in that context, the expression of one's faith as not so much as an extension of who one is, but as part of who one is I think an important opportunity to be given. Of course, in any context, there are people who are conscientious objectors. But I think one of the things that is real is that faith is not for disappearing in Ireland. And I think if people have an opportunity to explore it, to be part of it, as part of the daily life of the school, and if it's done well, and if it's done generously, in such a way that it's not exclusive, well then I think it's a good thing. Maybe back to what your colleague was asking me earlier about living in my youth in a culture of separation, where you don't have the opportunities to experience something beyond your own identity, well then your own identity can become rather narrowed. But yes, but with generosity, I think is what I would say.
Well, thank you very much, Archbishop. Unfortunately, that's all the time we
Is
have
that all
for
you
today.
have?
That's
Oh,
all
dear.
we have for today.
All right.
We have time for just one question from the audience, if anyone would like to ask one.
Yeah.
This lady here, first.
The decline in the Catholic vocations. Sorry.
Yeah.
The decline in the Catholic vocations is very evident at the moment. What's it like in your church?
In our tradition? Well, we're not numerically declining. We're much smaller. We're what? Theoretically, we're 4% of the population. When I lived in Cork, I think we were 1 to 1.5. That's what I meant. On average, we would have about 15 new clergy every year for our body. Men and women, that's just our tradition. We have recently, in the last, I suppose, 6 years, it started 3 years ago to roll out, we developed a new program of training, Master of Theology degree, which is at the NFQ, the National Framework Qualifications 9. And what we did was we negotiated with Trinity College that people's accredited prior learning could actually mean that combined with a Foundation Access course, they reached NFQ 8 and could go straight into NFQ 9. That has in many ways revolutionised the way in which we can accommodate people's vocation, because it's much more professionalised, it's more densely taught, but it's taught against three things, one of which is, I suppose, the academic content, the other is collaborative learning, and the other is formation. And you'd find that people who have significant life experience but have not had the opportunity for education at that particular intensity now have the opportunity to do so. Other people might come in with a bachelor's qualification in engineering, languages, anything like that. These people blend through the foundation year, and so they come into the course in a way that's equal. Now, why am I saying that? I'm saying that because we decided that the way in which we were training people was not in any way equipping them to talk about God, to talk about the life of the church, to talk about what you might call personal spirituality, because quite a lot of people live a spirituality in a way which is not necessarily feeding all the time into church life. We weren't actually educating people to talk to people who were educated. Now, that's not to say the people to whom we talked were uneducated, but there's a level of engagement which in a sense makes kind of the critical commendation of faith much more straightforward. And since then, something we hoped, we actually have much more young people. We're having people in their early 20s coming in, as well as people with greater life experience. I'm going to keep quiet.
We'll just take one more question if anybody has one.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I've admired the Anglican Church's decision to allow women to be ordained as priests. And I just wonder, I'm sure that has enhanced the life of your community.
Yes.
Would you recommend that the Catholic Church would follow suit?
Well, I suppose I have to approach that in a number of ways. First of all, if I explain a little bit to you about how it happened to us and what, in a sense, not so much our justification but our substantiation of it is. The ordination of women, it first happened, I think, during the Korean War in the Anglican Communion. There was a Bishop Hall, who was the Bishop of Hong Kong, and there was a woman called Florence Lee, I think her name was, who was a nurse who was working behind the lines in the Korean War. And she was obviously ministering in a healthcare way to people who had excruciating ailments and injuries. And these people weren't able to receive any sacrament or any ministry. So what happened was that the bishop, this was in the 50s, ordained her, because she was the only person present who had access to people at times of critical need in their life. And she was probably the only person that they really trusted. So that's how the ordination of women happened in the Anglican Communion. And for a while, as often happens when there are situations of ecclesiastical crisis, people are kind of put into the naughty corner, and then somebody says, well, actually, we'd like to see how you smile, and so they come out of the naughty corner. And now there would be women in a number of provinces right across the Anglican world. One of the things that is particular to the Church of Ireland, which ordained women from 1988, is that from the start, women could be ordained bishops, priests and deacons. Whereas Church of England, as you're probably aware, is still in a bit of a mess, because they went deacon and priest, glass floor. And now they're battling with the idea, can we actually chip this open from below and open the whole thing up? It looks as if they're getting there, but what happens is that when a thing freezes, people quite enjoy the ice.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it
We'll
there,
leave it
Grace.
that.
Yes, I'm
Okay,
sorry,
that's fine.
we're running out
Yeah.
of time. Thank you very much for joining us
Yeah.
here at Talking Heads. We'll be back the same time, same place next week for the next instalment, where we'll be joined by Dr. Satish Krishnamurti, leader of the Hindu community here on campus. Until then, from me, all the team, and from Archbishop Michael Jackson, thank you very much for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry to cut you off there.